Good afternoon. Let's begin. My name is Trevor Bechtel. I'm the facilitator of the Real World Perspectives on Poverty Solutions speaker series, and we're really excited about today's speaker. And I would like to just begin by noting that there's coffee and cookies at the back, so help yourself to that. And I would like to introduce my colleague, Jessica Cruz, who is going to introduce our speaker for today.
Gracias, gracias. How are we doing today? That's pretty good. Usually on a Friday, especially, you say, hey, and people are kind of quiet. So thank you. Happy Friday. All right. So Buju, which is Anishinaabe. So given that we're on the ancestral homelands of the Anishinaabe community, I wanted to begin with that greeting in particular. Buju, greetings and welcome. Gracias for having me here today, Trevor. I appreciate you inviting me. So as was mentioned, my name is Jessica Cruz. I'm the managing director of a project called Crafting Democratic Futures. It's situated within the Center for Social Solutions here at the University of Michigan in the College of LSA. The founder is Dr. Earl Lewis, who you may have heard of, and he actually sends his regards to you. He says he's had quite a bit of email exchanges with you. He was really looking forward to meeting with you, but he's on the road right now. So he's traveling and like I said, sends his regards through me. So welcome from him as well. All right. So what is Crafting Democratic Futures? I'll take a quick moment to situate that context for you all to kind of explain why I'm here and how it connects to the work that you're doing. So CDF, Crafting Democratic Futures, is about situating colleges and universities in community-based reparation solutions. We have a national project. So it's a team that spans across the central north region of the country, across the Midwest, and down the eastern seaboard. So specifically, these teams are Carnegie Mellon University, Emory, Rutgers, Newark, Concordia, Connecticut, Spelman, Wesleyan, Wofford. We're also partnering with Pittsburgh Public Media Flagship Institute, which is WQED, a multimedia company. They're a key partner. So they're particularly charged with creating a documentary on the role of race and reparations in the United States. And it's going to be distributed by PBS. That announcement will be coming more formally shortly. We're hoping it'll be out early next year. So again, community-based reparation solutions. Two quick examples. Concordia College is a great example because they're focused on the indigenous, they're focused on the intergenerational trauma caused by Indian boarding schools. So they're partnering quite heavily with indigenous communities in that area. And that's very powerful. A quick example of the kind of work that they're doing is looking at language learning as a form of reparations, right? Because folks that were forced into Indian boarding schools over time lost many things, including their native language. So again, given that we're on the ancestral homelands of the Anishinaabe community in this area, that's again why I began with Buju and Ani. Another one is, of course, us, the University of Michigan. So we're focused on Detroit, Ypsilanti, and I love Ypsi, by the way, and Flint. Each of these partners has a community fellow. So lead PI, but also a community fellow. I will say that in Detroit, there's, of course, the Reparations Task Force that recently passed with 80% of the vote ballot initiative. Lauren Hood is the co-chair, and she's one of our community fellows. Elise Asbury Payne is another community fellow for Washtenaw County, also recently launched an advisory council on reparations for the county. And in Flint, we have Asa Zucaro, who's here. Thank you, Asa, for being here. Community fellow for this area. Let me see if I get this right. Executive Director of the Latinx Technology and Community Center, and looking at a potential reparations task force, et cetera, in the Flint area as well. So there's a lot more to be said, but that's all I will say. Now, given that context, I think, I hope it's clear why I'm excited to be here and introduce Cornell to us today. So quite a list of accomplishments. I'm gonna read it and hopefully get it right. So Cornell William Brooks is Hauser Professor of Practice and Nonprofit Organizations and Professor of the Practice of Public Leadership and Social Justice at the Harvard Kennedy School. He's also Director of the William Monroe Trotter Collaborative for Social Justice at the school's Center for Public Leadership and Visiting Professor of the Practice of Prophetic Religion and Public Leadership at Harvard Divinity School. Brooks is also the former president and CEO of the NAACP, a civil rights attorney, and an ordained minister. He served as the 18th president of the NAACP from 2014 to 2017. And it was under his leadership that the NAACP secured 12 significant legal victories, including laying the groundwork for the first statewide legal challenge to prison-based gerrymandering. He also reinvigorated the activist social justice heritage of the NAACP, dramatically increasing its membership, particularly online and among millennials. Among the many demonstrations from Ferguson to Flint during his tenure, he both conceived and led America's journey for justice, that march from Selma, Alabama to Washington, D.C. over 40 days and 1,000 miles. Prior to leading the NAACP, he was president and CEO of the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, which, as I mentioned to him directly a moment ago, is one of our community partners for one of our Crafting Democratic Futures teams, Rutgers University in New York. He also served as senior counsel and acting director of the Office of Communications Business Opportunities at the Federal Communications Commission, executive director of the Fair Housing Council in Greater Washington, and a trial attorney at both the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law and the U.S. Department of Justice. As DOJ trial attorney, he secured a record-setting settlement for housing discrimination victims and filed the first government case alleging housing discrimination against a nursing home. He served as a judicial clerk for the Chief Judge Sam J. Ervin III on the U.S. Court of Appeals and for the 4th District. He holds a JD from Yale Law School, where he was senior editor of the Yale Law Journal and member of the Yale Law and Policy Review, a Master of Divinity from Boston University School of Theology, where he was a Martin Luther King Jr. scholar. He has a BA from Jackson State University. He was a recipient of several honorary degrees, including Boston University, Drexel University, St. Peter's University, and Payne Theological Seminary. And he also has the highest alumni awards from Boston University and Boston University School of Theology. And if that wasn't enough, he's also a 4th-generation ordained minister in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Cornell William Brooks to the podium.
Good morning. In my classes at the Kennedy School, I have an expression. We don't do decaffeinated classes. All of our classes are fully caffeinated. So good morning. So let me just begin with the word of appreciation to Trevor and to all the conveners of this lecture series, to Jessica, and to a friend of mine whom I think I walked with for the better part of 900 miles, Sheila Bell, who's on the journey for justice. So I want you to do me a favor and recognize the people who brought us into this room, including the folks who brought us the coffee and the cookies, who prepared the presentation, and who essentially made it possible for us to be here. So can we put our hands together for them? So I simply want to begin by saying how appreciative I am for the opportunity to talk about poverty and reparations as a response to poverty. I don't take it for granted that we have this occasion to be in this room at this moment in history to talk about a movement which extends over 100 years into the past, over 150 years. So let us begin with an image. Before you is an image of a woman by the name of Cali House. And if you can imagine an arc of history, an arc of economics, an arc of fiscal policy that extends from Murfreesboro, Tennessee to Ann Arbor, Michigan in this moment, which is to say that Cali House was enslaved in her infancy. born into slavery, raised as a child in slavery in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. I'm gonna move this down just a little bit. How's that? She was born into slavery, raised in her infancy in servitude in the state of Tennessee. She grew up, became a washerwoman, a laundress, not unlike Rosa Parks. Cali House subsequently married, had 5 children, had 6 children. 5 lived to adulthood. But Cali House, looking over the landscape of the South, littered with the bodies, the being, the diminished dignity of Black people. She, not being a graduate of Michigan's Policy School or the law school, not being a graduate of the Harvard Kennedy School or the law school, this formerly untutored, formerly uneducated laundress, washerwoman, conceives of a repertory scheme for justice, which is to say Cali House partnered with others to create the first grassroots movement for reparations in this nation's history, numbering at least 400,000 dues-paying members all across the South. This is well before the NAACP, well before the Urban League, well before the AFL-CIO, well before the ADL, well before the women's movement. This woman creates a grassroots movement for reparations. Why is this important? It's important because reparations is not merely about the math of compensating disgrace and diminished dignity. It is also about the flesh and blood reality of those who survived slavery. So Cali House creates this organization, the National Ex-Slave Mutual Benefit Pension and Relief Association, with chapters all across the South. Cali House conceives of a reparatory justice framework in which she conceives of reparations based upon the Civil War pension system, which is to say she saw the 1 out of every 5 Black people then living around the turn of the last century as being not unlike Union soldiers, not unlike Confederate soldiers, which is to say they were compensated for the length of their service and the degree to which their abilities were diminished. That is to say, being wounded or shot or harmed. And she thought that those who were lynched, those who were beaten, those who were raped should be compensated in a morally and fiscally similar way. And so this Cali House conceives of this scheme for reparations. This is critically important because today's debate, today's discourse is rooted in that reality. Not only that, Cali House, this same woman, Cali House brings the first federal lawsuit for reparations. Right? Again, let's remind you, she wasn't a graduate of the University of Michigan Law School. She brings the first suit for reparations, and the court says essentially we don't have jurisdiction. I want to slip this in. This is just a parenthetical. This is a footnote. You don't need to write this down, but it's just too good not to be noted. Right? So Cali House, her theory of the case was that taxes were collected on cotton harvested by enslaved people, and that these dollars were sent to Washington. They were unallocated. So in terms of her fiscal and moral imagination, she imagined that these dollars were in the basement of the U.S. Treasury waiting to be allocated. And she thought that you could go to court and essentially say if cotton was harvested by those who were enslaved, uncompensated, that this money can be used to fund reparations. Somebody needs to put their hands together for the legal and moral imagination in that case, right? Come on. So Cali House files this lawsuit. And again, because we want to ground this talk in the reality of our forebears, we want to take note of the fact that this Black woman was not supported by Booker T. Washington. Not supported by W.E.B. Du Bois, that distinguished graduate of Harvard with a PhD in sociology, not supported by the men. That's just a parenthetical. You don't need to write that down. Cali House wasn't supported by them. But oddly enough, perversely enough, ironically enough, a senator by the name of Edmund Pettus, that name may seem familiar, unsettlingly familiar. You recall Edmund Pettus when John Lewis and Amelia Boynton attempted to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. That same segregationist Edmund Pettus supported reparations back then. Why? Because he assumed that if Black people in the South get anything, certainly white people will get something. Now, why do we begin with this modest story? We begin with the story because on reparations, we essentially face three impossibilities that I'll talk about that are addressed in a paper written by my colleague Linda Bilmus and I that will be published next Juneteenth. And this research that animates this paper and that serves as the basis of this talk is grounded in Cali House's story, but also grounded in law and policy and in the fiscal realities of the federal government today. So we want to just start with this threefold argument against reparations, what I call three impossibilities. All across the country, when people talk about reparations, even now, this many years after Cali House brought a federal lawsuit, this many years after Cali House conceived of a way of having reparations as a response, let me note here, to the desperate poverty of those who were enslaved back then and who had survived slavery back then. Because let me just note again, this is parenthetical, you don't need to write this down. The end of slavery was the largest homelessness event in American history. So in other words, when 3.9 million, 4 million people are freed via the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment, they are suddenly homeless, without home, people living in fields, sleeping out in the open, unprotected by the elements. These folks were desperately poor. So reparations, let's be clear here, was not a response to some trivial racial injustice, but it was a response to real and desperate and ragged poverty, right? All right. So here we are this many years later facing three impossibilities. The first of which is that reparations is said to be impossible, presumed to be impossible because slavery was so long ago. I sense that this temporal impossibility is not really clear. May I make this clear? Right? So no less a figure than Senator Mitch McConnell, who said quite bluntly, why should we have reparations for something that happened 150 years ago? So in other words, it is assumed that slavery having happened so long ago is impossible to address. There's a kind of temporal impossibility, right? You hear this not merely from those in Washington, but even among people who might be beneficiaries of reparations, right? So even, Black and brown people say, that happened a long time ago. It's regrettable, but there's nothing we can do about that, okay? Secondly, reparations to the whole of some subset of 41 million African Americans is presumed to be too difficult. It's administratively impossible. How do we do reparations for African Americans when they come in so many different colors and so many different backgrounds? How is that possible? It's too cumbersome. It's too difficult. We can't possibly do that. This is an administrative impossibility. Thirdly, reparations for Black Americans and the presumably incalculable harm suffered by them is prohibitively expensive. Now, this is a moment in the talk in which the fiscal conservatives grab hold to their wallets. Right? We start talking about money, right? Again, I only know how to do these talks in a caffeinated way. So, if you hear something interesting, let me know. Okay. So, the fiscal conservatives, when we talk about reparations and we talk about the magnitude and the heterogeneity of the harms, right? This astounding diversity of these harms and the depth of these harms, it's just assumed to be prohibitively expensive. Okay? I know the students may not have yet begun to pay taxes, but for those of you who have begun to pay taxes, this is a sticking point, okay? And as a consequence of these three impossibilities, it is often stated or assumed that reparations for Black people are aberrational and exceptional. And the thesis of this paper is that reparations is in fact regular and routine. Okay, may I say that again? Reparations, when we talk about them for Black people, literally it's assumed to be aberrational and exceptional. This is unusual. It's something akin to an act of God, like a hurricane or a tornado or a biblical flood or pestilence, that we can actually do anything about these incalculable harms. Okay? But I want to suggest to you, our research suggests that reparations is actually stunningly, astoundingly regular and routine. Okay? All right. How do we make sure? Oh, here we go. All right. So to address this matter of the impossibilities of reparations, in our research, we endeavored to do two things. We created what we call a taxonomy of harms and a audit, if you will, of responses to harms. By taxonomy of harms, we merely mean a classification of harms, right? You remember in high school biology, you had taxonomies dividing plants and animals, right? And when it comes to racial harms, we can do something akin to that we can divide these harms. And I want to go beyond that, right? Your history books often allocate the harms. They're housing harms, they're employment harms, they're political harms when it comes to Black people. But these harms have been inflicted due to federal policy, yes, actions, inaction, negligence, and indirect effects. We want to make the case here that these harms are not limited to chattel slavery, and that these harms, I want to note this here, are intertwined. What we mean by that is quite often when we talk about the harms that Black people have suffered, we often talk about them separately. We talk about lynching and housing discrimination. We talk about redlining and apprenticeships. But we talk about these harms as separate. And we want to make the case here that the harms are not only direct and indirect, but they're intertwined. But not only are they intertwined, and when we want to make the case here, that these harms compound over time, right? Now, this is critically important because when we talk about addressing the harms, we can underestimate them if we don't look at the ways in which they interact. And not only are we likely to underestimate the harms in terms of the way they interact, but we're also likely to misdiagnose, underdiagnose the potential solutions and responses to those harms. Because, for example, here, if you have a person who has a cardiac arrest, a person who has a cardiac arrest may perspire. They may clutch their heart. They may have some difficulty breathing. Now, if you attempt to address the fact that they are perspiring with deodorant, might not actually do anything for the heart. When it comes to racial justice, this is what we do sometimes. We attempt to address a particular harm, but not another harm, and we don't look at the ways they interact. Hey, wait with me. I just want to make sure that this is coming together, right? So these harms are intergenerational, they compound, they're intersectional over time, okay? In this paper, we look at these harms illustratively, not exhaustively, and we look at housing, wages, employment, labor markets, criminal justice, healthcare, education, the franchise, the vote, and violence, okay? These harms represent harms to Black American bodies, opportunities, and wealth. And we, for the purposes of this presentation, want to focus on housing, education, and wages, and employment and labor markets. Okay? All right. Against this presumed impossibility of harms, impossibility, we want to juxtapose them to what we call a long-standing norm in government. Now, this is where it gets interesting. I know sometimes we talk about the federal government, it can be boring, but this is where I need you to get excited, all right? In government, there is a norm, a kind of moral expectation that when someone suffers a harm through no fault of their own, the government will often compensate them. Right? This is almost like a moral or ethical axiom applied to fiscal policy. Again, let me show you why this is important. Now, let's say, what's your name? Rachel. Okay, let's say Rachel has this absolutely astounding house perched on a cliff in a hurricane zone, right? Now, but Rachel, smart person that she is, has a house fully insured. So when the hurricane comes along predictably year after year, takes out her home, she's compensated. She's subsidized. Her community can receive economic assistance. Her business can receive favorable loans. She's been harmed through no fault of her own, but this axiom, this principle, this norm operates to her advantage. If, your name, Peter. If Peter is an industrious farmer, he raises a wonderful crop of whatever every year, right? Probably not too good for the American diet, but let's say a wonderful crop, okay? He experiences a crop failure, right? The U.S. Department of Agriculture has all manner of programs to assist him in the wake of a crop failure based upon this norm, right? Now, we then argue in our paper that this norm is represented in what we call reparatory compensation. Okay? Now, this is critically important because if we are to understand reparations in the broader context, the ways in which it helps many Americans, although we don't call it reparations, we have to appreciate the undergirding norm and look at the ways in which it's applied, look at the beneficiaries, look at the context, so that we might draw analogies to the racial harms which are compounded, intertwined, interconnected over generations that represent a loss of intergenerational wealth and represent the racial wealth gap. Okay? Critically important. Okay? This taxonomy of harms suggests, and this norm of reparatory compensation, and I want you to hear this, suggests that the government actually has the resources, the administrative and programmatic and moral imagination, and the experience to address a whole range of racial harms. This is critically important. Why? Because when advocates, and I'm not just talking about the sophisticates in this room, right? So you are the sophisticates. But what about the people who never stepped foot on to the University of Michigan? What about the folks who are not fellows in the program we just described, who are dealing with this whole issue of reparations at the local and the municipal level, who are unaware that there's all kinds of programmatic and fiscal and moral precedent elsewhere in government, right? So they're analytically unequipped, ill-equipped, ill-prepared to deal with the arguments that defeat them day in and day out. So this norm of reparatory compensation resembles religious and human rights norms, right? So in other words, if you look at the people of the book, of the Abrahamic tradition, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, but also Hinduism, also philosophers like John Locke, all of them have these strands of reparations built in. So when people say reparations is something the radical young people do, right? Well, some of those radical young people are as old as the Bible. Okay? Okay? But this is just a philosophical and moral and theological tradition you stand in. So in addition to that, we know, of course, the United Nations, through various conventions, has formal categories of reparations: restitution, making people whole; compensation, the use of money; rehabilitation, putting people back into the same place; satisfaction, again, restoring them; guarantees of non-repetition, right? In other words, in terms of reparations, it's not merely about me healing the wound I inflicted on you, but it's also you having the assurance I won't re-wound you. Right? So this whole issue of reparations is not merely about money. Money is the means by which we can have a deeper discourse in terms of reconciliation and healing, but money is important. Okay? And so the implementation of this norm of reparatory compensation through government programs makes it clear that reparations is regular and routine. Okay? All right. So now let's talk about harms. In terms of harms, we talked about emancipation is a homelessness event, if you will. Right? And we recall, of course, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, government supported, government aided, government encouraged white vigilantes burning, looting, destroying whole neighborhoods, Black Wall Street, back in 1921. We, of course, have all seen 3 elderly Black people, Black women, who survived Tulsa, going to the House of Representatives, going to Congress, seeking reparations 100 years later, right? And this, of course, was a housing event, a homelessness event. But not only that, look at the picture on the right. Who is that? Who's that? Martin Luther King. So here's Martin Luther King right after having been assaulted with a brick in Chicago in a demonstration against housing discrimination. And you recall, of course, how was the Fair Housing Act passed? When was it passed? It was passed in 1968, but it was passed literally in the wake of Dr. King's assassination as the cities across America were going up in flames, right? These were housing harms in terms of Jim Crow discrimination, but also housing harms in terms of redlining, housing harms in terms of rental and sales discrimination, but housing harms also related to violence. Right? There are ways in which we talk about housing in which we don't acknowledge the relationship between violence and housing. Again, I can tell it's not quite clear. Ida B. Wells. Who knows her? Just come on, talk to me. I know, I'm just picking on you. Ida B. Wells. Who was she? Just for the folks in the back. Mm-hmm. That's right.
Made it real internationally.
Mm-hmm.
People didn't hide it under the rug.
That's right.
And she was right.
That's right. So Ida B. Wells. Oh, this is so good. Look, if y'all are not excited, you need to be, right? So Ida B. Wells, right? Du Bois was a sociologist, but Ida B. Wells did the Red Record, right? She did the analysis of lynching, right? And why people were lynched, why Black men were lynched. But for her efforts, her newspaper was destroyed, right? Not only that, buildings all across the city of Memphis were destroyed. And not only that, 2 of her friends were murdered. Not only that, people were literally beaten and brutalized and assaulted all across the city of Memphis. Now, why is this important? It's important because this racial violence in response to her emancipatory efforts led to homelessness and economic dislocation. In other words, the people of Memphis literally got up and left in mass. Right? So housing is related to violence. So when we talk about how to compensate these harms, it requires a kind of historical and economic nuance. Right? We can't just carve up the Black experience like pieces of pie or a cake, but we have to look at the ways in which things relate so that we understand how do we compensate and what do we do to compensate, as well as how much, right? So housing harms, all right. Housing related to wages, employment, and labor markets. I'm just recapping a history, but we know, of course, about employment discrimination. All the studies show the ways in which people are discriminated against based upon presumed to be African-American sounding names. We know the discrimination that people face with criminal records, the fact that a white man with a criminal record has less of a chance of getting certain kinds of jobs than a black man without a criminal record, right? And that black men with criminal records, of course, face severe discrimination. But this goes back even farther than that. We know that after slavery was abolished, that black children were apprenticed. Now, this is for those of you, anybody here looking to get an internship, this would be unsettling, right? If you've ever put together a resume, this would be unsettling, right? Why? Because you list your apprenticeships, you list your internships, but back in the 1800s, this is not quite what they had in mind, right? In other words, black children could be apprenticed to their former slave masters if their parents were deemed to be unfit, their parents were deemed to be unemployed, their parents were deemed to be beyond the jurisdiction, beyond the control of their white slave masters. So they could literally take the children. So this apprenticeship system didn't merely last until the 1800s. It extended well into the 1900s until we mechanized farming. Okay? So this was a form of slavery involving young people. Now, of course, this is a kind of labor market brutality in terms of children taking their uncompensated labor. But now let's look at what happened with the adults, right? Now, we know about the kind of generic racial discrimination in terms of wages and promotion and that kind of thing. But let's think about the New Deal, Franklin Roosevelt, right? Literally re-engineering American society. But let's think about who was left out in terms of Social Security. Agricultural workers and domestic workers, which coincidentally happened to be where most black people worked at that time. So at the point at which we have these social benefits that literally elevate the economic trajectory of the American economy and the American populace, black people are conspicuously left out. So these black agricultural workers, so what was done to the children by force and by violence and subterfuge is done to the adults by legislation. Okay? And this has profound economic consequences over generations. Right? So again, we're looking at the ways in which these harms interact. Again, what this means is that this reparations can't be left to the economists. This is also in the purview of the historians. I would even go so far as to say, and again, this is an untested proposition, those who are concerned about ethics and theology. All right. So just this gets interesting. All right, harms related to education. Now, here we have Joseph Maddox, okay, who was a vet returning from World War II to my home state of South Carolina. First day on a bus back home, he gets into a dispute with a bus driver and he is blinded. This, of course, leads to the desegregation of the military, but it also underscores the ways in which GI vets were treated and makes an argument for reparations. That's somebody calling in with a question. All right. You know, when they tell you to silence your phone, generally speaking, the speaker does that. Okay. So here we have, Mr. Maddox and his generation are literally systematically excluded from the GI Bill, right? The GI Bill extends unemployment benefits, it extends housing benefits, it extends employment benefits and educational benefits to veterans all across the country. It literally lifts and creates the modern middle class all across America. It builds the American suburbs, if you will, right? Black vets are excluded in ways that are quite subtle, right? So in terms of education, where Black vets are limited in terms of where they can use their GI benefits to HBC, historically Black colleges and universities. So why is that a problem? Well, if you can use your GI benefits at the University of Michigan, there are professional schools, law schools, schools of engineering, school of policy. You could enter into the professions. Many of the HBCBUs, the Black colleges and universities across the South, did not have schools of engineering, did not have, my goodness. I mean, wow, okay. I'm just, the best thing to do is just turn it off. Okay. Okay. So Black soldiers were prevented in the main from entering the professions through the use of the GI Bill. Okay? So that's barrier one. Barrier two related to distance. In other words, if you lived in the North, I should say, did not live near an HBCBU, you were less able to use your benefits. But even institutions like Harvard prevented Sergeant Isaac Woodard from using his benefits there, even though he was admitted to a graduate program, because they didn't want to create the precedent of Black vets using their benefits to go to Harvard University. So there's discrimination in the North, discrimination in the South, discrimination within HCBUs, and discrimination in terms of capacity. In other words, the Black colleges and universities could only take so many vets, right? So this has profound implications in terms of education, but it also relates to housing. Why? Because if Black vets were prevented from using their benefits because their benefits had to be used and implemented at the state level. So in other words, segregationist governments, local government, and local banks with discriminatory policies and zoning and essentially restricted loans prevented Black vets from using their benefits to buy housing. This literally meant that the GI Bill had zero effect in terms of the income of Black vets, which of course has everything to do with the housing as a generator, a prime driver for intergenerational wealth to this very day. Okay? Now, how does that relate to reparatory compensation? Very quickly. So we look at, in this country, people who harvest fish, fishermen. If there is a flood or some means by which they're unable to harvest fish, they're compensated. When there are floods, natural disasters, when there's a trade agreement which has an impact on a community, literally communities receive economic assistance, loans, scholarships, job assistance, right? Christmas tree farms, okay? I'm a Christian. I'll just pick on the Christians. So for those of you who are not, this is an example. Christmas trees are subsidized, right? You don't have reparations, but if I'm selling Christmas trees and there's a crop failure, some kind of pestilence, some bug or something that destroys my crops, you receive a government subsidy, right? Anybody know that? Okay, all right. Let's say these are just some of the great many programs in which people receive compensation if they suffered some harm through no fault of their own. And I'm going to give you a good example. This is one that if this does not elevate your blood pressure, you really need to check to see whether or not you're awake or alive, right? Here we have the Marshall Islands, in which our government dropped nuclear bombs from the sky, destroying the environment, destroying communities, impacting lives in terms of illness and sickness. And yet, many years later, our government extended an apology. We provided economic assistance. We provided compensation to those who suffered directly, but also indirectly. And somebody in the back row, you need to write this down. You know, when people talk about reparations and like, how do we sort this out? Who's eligible? Well, when it comes to disasters like this, there's something called presumed eligibility. which means if you live near the harm, you were alive during the harm, you are presumed to be harmed, and as such, presumed to be eligible for compensation. Somebody in the back row needs to be, this is upsetting, right? Why? Because if our government could apologize, provide a holistic, comprehensive ecological compensation to people who were bombed by the government in the Marshall Islands, what about Tulsa? Those women live to be 100. You know, one of the women, and I'm blanking on the name, just wrote a wonderful new book. She's still uncompensated. But now the folks in the Marshall Islands deserve compensation, most certainly, but isn't there an analogy here? Aren't these harms somewhat similar? I mean, now, God forbid, none of us would want a nuclear bomb to drop on the top of the University of Michigan. Certainly not. But if we dropped a conventional bomb, wouldn't you want compensation? Or the folks in Tulsa suffer from conventional bombs? Those bombs, of course, destroyed their entire neighborhoods in Black Wall Street, but they've not been compensated. Okay. U.S. nuclear testing in the Western states, 1945, 1962, not just in the Marshall Islands, in the Western states. There were hearings, compensation in 1990, an apology to 40,000 people, $3.5 billion in terms of a trust, broader compensation in 2000, 60,000 people impacted, 600,000 people impacted. Anybody seeing the analogies here? Anybody sensing a sense of possibility? In other words, if it's fiscally possible, if it's morally imaginable, if it's programmatically possible, why aren't we doing it? Okay, all right. After 3 decades, the Nevada site being a nuclear test, the U.S. House of Representatives had hearings. They concluded all evidence suggesting the radiation was having harmful effects, be it on the sheep or the people, was not only disregarded, but suppressed. So we acknowledge the ways in which we suppress what it is that we in fact knew, okay? We talked about the Marshall Islands. Again, all of these programs responding to this. Now, here's where it gets good. I know you didn't expect for us to talk about Civil War vets and investment bankers, right? Did you expect that? Come on, talk. Let's think about this. For Civil War vets, we have pensions, right? It's a form of deferred compensation, right? Okay. Harriet Tubman, you recall her, right? Harriet Tubman, Moses of her people. Harriet Tubman, the first woman who led troops into war in the Civil War in the Low Country of South Carolina. You know, she freed 70 people on the Underground Railroad, but did you know she freed 700 people with Union soldiers? She had to fight for a pension, right? All right. But there's something called, as you know, the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation. Now, here's where we come to the investment bankers. I know I can tell you're really interested in this. When we had Lehman Brothers, right? This wonderful investment bank. In the wake of the credit crisis, in the wake of the foreclosure crisis, when Lehman Brothers went belly up, when they went out of business, those pensions were guaranteed and secured and protected by the federal government. So the question for us is, if it's good for investment bankers, could it be good for anybody else? Posing the question, right? That was a rhetorical question, but hopefully one of you has an answer. All right. All right. Native Americans, I'm hastening toward the end here. We are, of course, well aware of the genocidal assault, massive dislocation of Native Americans, including the land upon which we stand. And we're looking at the ways in which our government, not enough, at least categorically and conceptually, suggesting it's possible, has provided some form of reparatory compensation going back generations. So this whole notion that we can't deal with reparations for Black people if it involves multiple generations, there are actually examples in government that suggest that we can do this. All right? All right. I'm going to hasten to some conclusions. We're calling for a national commission on reparations, okay? To develop a reparations program to address a full range of racial harms. We're also calling for, this is quite pedestrian and straightforward, listening sessions and providing the public with data. In other words, what would happen if the federal government did an analysis of reparatory compensation and gave the data to the people, right? So in other words, let's not have a debate about whether or not reparations is the aberration or exception when it comes to Black people. Well, let's talk about the ways in which reparations are done every day. Let's have people talk about, well, are Christmas trees equivalent to people who are 100 years old and who were bombed by state government in Oklahoma? Are these things analogous? Posing the question, right? What would happen if we had public hearings and provided people with data? What would happen if we had an audit of federal reparatory compensation program detailing their budget, the beneficiaries, the legal authority, and the ways in which our government is already responding to a multitude of harms, right? What would happen? An audit of all federal regulatory compensation programs since 1865, a review of the World War II and Korean War Black vets, their stories, collecting their narratives, right? Creating a taxonomy and a study of racial harms, issuing a national reparatory compensation report as an evidentiary, analytic, and programmatic predicate for the feasibility of reparations for Black Americans, right? Okay. In other words, what would happen if we took what we have, look what we've done as precedent, okay? So with that said, I want to end on this little note. When we talked about Harriet Tubman, right? And how Harriet Tubman freed 770 people. But what if Harriet Tubman had compared the 770 people she freed to the 3.94 million people who were enslaved? She might have given up. The point I want to make to you, in spite and in the midst of all these numbers and data, is that hope is not empirically demonstrated. It's morally chosen. If we are to have reparations in this country, have reconciliation in this country, have racial healing in this country, it is something that we ultimately choose to do using the data, using the history, using the economics to make the case. With that said, thank you.
Thank you so much for that excellent talk. Probing so many different kind of ideas and a lot of points of connection to other things that we've learned throughout this speaker series. I'm thinking particularly about FEMA relief and how you need a deed to your property to kind of show that you've been harmed. And a lot of people in the South have heirs property, which doesn't have that kind of clean deed. So you can have a very big house. I think it was Rachel who had the very big house.
Massive house.
And you get all of that fixed if you got deed to it.
That's
you
right.
can have a very small house and you don't have clear deed and you can't get any money. So it's it kind of patterns again. So let's take a few questions here at the end of this great talk.
Thank you for your talk. And you mentioned at the beginning that it was based on an article that'll be published next Juneteenth. And I just wondered, where will that article be published?
Sure. It's in the Russell Sage Journal of Social Science. And there will be essentially a double volume journal focused on reparations. And we have authors here in the room. And it's I think it represents a collection of good people with some ideas about what we might do and the analytic resources that are available to us.
What other questions do we have?
Love that. So we saved that for the very end, right? So William Darity, who's the editor of this journal, he's an economist, labor economist at Duke, has really talked about the racial wealth gap as a proxy for the harms, right? To the tune of $14 trillion, right? And so when you, just by way of an, I'm a lawyer, so sometimes it's hard for me to visualize that amount of money, right? But if you took $1 trillion as dollar bills and stacked them up from the ground, they would extend way out into the atmosphere, into space. That's the kind of money we're talking about, okay? Now, here's what I want you to just take note of. You remember that chart of all those programs? When you look at the federal programs that we use today, I'm not talking about anything we create. The programs we use today in terms of reparatory compensation literally represent millions, billions, even trillions of dollars. Right now, in terms of what we do. So we look at how we respond to natural disasters, literally billions of dollars. Service members. Now, the question you might ask, I would ask if I were you, is, are those beneficiaries, ostensible supposed beneficiaries of racial justice or racial harm reparations, are they comparable to someone who lost their house in a hurricane or Christmas tree farm? And what I want to suggest to you is, obviously, I think so. But the reason why I think we as a country have difficulty answering that question is because we haven't had the conversation. We have not studied the issue. I mean, study, I don't mean here at the University of Michigan, but across the country. So when we look at other instances where we had extended reparations, Japanese Americans in turn incarcerated during World War II under Ronald Reagan. That was their second attempt at reparations. And it happened when the country began to have a conversation about what was done to Japanese Americans. We've seen that in terms of Native Americans. We've seen that in terms of people who were irradiated and bombed by our government. So my point to you is, it's both a numbers response, how much, but it's also a how response in terms of who and how do we have that conversation. And we need both, right? Is that responsive? Partly, okay. So here's what I would, yeah, here's what I would say is, if we look at what we're already doing, we can afford and we can do what has already been done for the people who need it done, right? So as was suggested, let me give you a concrete example. We know all across the South, land was straight out stolen, just stolen, right? And I'm not talking about subterfuge, I'm talking about through violence. We have this documented as a matter of history. There are receipts, but those harms have not been addressed. And so the issue then becomes, do we do something about it? Can we afford to do something about it? And are we able to do something about it? What our research shows, in answer to all three, is yes. The issue becomes if we're willing to do it. And if we're willing to do it, has everything to do with us starting with, can we talk about the facts? Can we talk about the history? Can we talk about the economics?
I wanted to follow up on that question, and thank you also for this really engaging and interesting talk and conversation. And I want to follow up on that with another analogous example that you haven't talked about, and maybe you couldn't add it to the paper, which is crime victim compensation. In fact, in some states called crime victim reparations, using the exact word. So every state in the country will compensate an innocent victim of a crime for their out-of-pocket expenses associated with that crime. So I spent a few, this is like a leading question because I spent like several years studying it. I'm writing a book about it right now. But on the question of how much is this going to cost in the budget, when it came to that particular case, that was sort of the top level question. But the actual question that informed the political debate about getting those laws passing and now compensating any innocent victim across the country was not how much, but who would pay. And in the case of crime victim compensation, those debates unfolded in the 60s and 70s primarily, and the answer ended up being not the innocent taxpayer, all of us, but quote unquote criminals. And so the solution of financing that reparations program, which again still exists everywhere, is not general public funds, but mandatory criminal fines. It traffics in the logic of restitution, but it is quite literally not restitution, because it is asking everyone, no matter what the crime that you committed was, to pay into this fund that compensates innocent crime victims. So the question then from that, sorry for the long preamble, is not so much about, you know, the political will of sort of paying or even convincing us, which I think many of us, at least in this room, are probably convinced that there was harms, you know, no need to sort of convince us on that point. But I'm curious if you thought about this political question of when it actually comes to brass tacks of getting it done, not so much like the dollar amount, but then what happens when it's like, okay, what is the financing mechanism and what can happen? And I use the case of crime victim compensation as an exemplar in this regard, because the answer wasn't really great. While like the reparations do exist now, it is being funded by this racially regressive redistribution system that is taking money predominantly from people of color. And now these programs that are reliant on fines to persist need more people locked up, need more people fined in order to be paying out this sort of reparations. So the question is basically not so much about how much this costs, but who would pay and how you've thought about that and warding off against potentially some of these regressive ways of funding such a program. Thanks.
So excellent point. So we have thought about it. We need to see your book as well. So we have thought about it and included in the paper the use of these restitution funds. But the analogy we use is with vaccines, right? So in other words, in the criminal context, we essentially impose a fine on everyone who's committing any kind of offense, no matter what the offense is, and they all kind of put into a common pot from which victims are compensated. But if we look at the vaccine context, right, we impose essentially like an excise tax, if you will, on these vaccines, and we use the money from that where we have children who are harmed by a vaccine, they're compensated that way. So in the context of housing, one could think of an excise tax on loans, but look at where those loans are made. So in other words, where if there are communities where there's been redlining, massive housing discrimination, massive devaluation of the prime driver of intergenerational wealth, you could conceive of a scheme that says we use an excise tax here that's greater in order to compensate and not only restore individuals, but restore communities. So there are mechanisms, we've thought about that. But again, when we look at all these federal programs, what you see over and over again is a variety of funding mechanisms. And we were trying to make the broad point is it's not always about robbing Peter, to use a racial and biblical metaphor here, robbing Peter to pay Paul or robbing a white Peter to pay a black Paul, right? But it can be a matter of how do we impose excise taxes, fees in an equitable way, in a non-punitive way to achieve a just result. Yeah. Other questions? Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned a number of those programs, like the Social Security Administration, that were instituted in a way that were either specifically racist or operated in a racist way. And I just want to call attention to the USDA being a historically deeply racist organization within our government. And in the late 90s, they paid the largest settlement in US history to Black farmers. And I forget the number of Black farmers who received it, but they got something like $60,000 each. Mm-hmm. Incidentally, you called me out as being a hypothetical farmer. I was a farmer for 8 years. Okay. And so I know that for most farmers, $60,000 is like not very much money, even in the 90s, right? And so, and there's a really phenomenal Code Switch, I think is a 2-part episode about a farmer growing sugarcane, I think in Louisiana, who loses his property because the USDA systematically excludes him from favorable terms on loans. And so it's still happening. Right. So like, I guess my question is, knowing that some of the very organizations that are, and I would say that the Farm Bill is like reparations year in and year out, like for farmers, right? Like when Trump declared the trade war, the farmers got $18 billion, right? And so how do you turn that ship that would in some ways be necessary to compensate Black farmers who continue to suffer terrible discrimination? Right. How do you get that kind of systemically racist organization to get on board with this?
So part of it is helping people recognize the ways in which the government is punishing people who've already been punished. Number one, that's the obvious point. The less obvious point here is helping people understand the ways in which they're being punished by somebody beside them being punished. right? So in other words, those black farmers, to the extent that they are being punished, white farmers don't suffer the same, but there are economic consequences. And certainly there are economic benefits for black racial harms being addressed for white communities. So for example, look across the country, when we look at those counties with the highest slave ownership rates, going all the way back to the days of slavery, those are the same places with the least investment in infrastructure, the same places with the worst investment in the schools, the same places which suffer from multi-generational poverty across the board for everybody. So part of our challenge here is getting people out of this mindset that if it helps them, it must hurt me, as opposed to if it helps somebody else, it could help me. Like we compensate farmers, and I think you as a farmer would admit this. Farming is not a wealthy profession for the people who actually do it, right? But the subsidies to the corporate farmers and everybody else gets a trickle down, right? It does help the country, right? We're not depending on somebody else for our bread basket. Part of it is making a broader argument, a universalist argument, without ducking the racial specificity that's necessary. Like we cannot get away from the fact that, listen, I mean, here's the thing. The Christmas tree farmers, great. But when you had like literally generations of black children who literally were treated like slave labor for, well over 100 years, that's a history we got to deal with, but deal with it in a way that essentially says, again, to white middle America, this is something we can do, should do, and would be beneficial to do. And again, I go back to, if Edmund Pettus, if a segregationist understood that there might be some benefit to white people from doing the right thing, even if it meant helping black people, there might be a 2023 lesson in that.
I think we'll draw to a close there. We're running low on time. Let's thank Reverend Dr. Brooks one more time. If you're a student in the course, there'll be a discussion prompt for you soon. Ask me any other questions on email, and we'll see you all next week for the next in our series. Have a good day.
Good day.